Hello, my name is Chad Stotler. I'm the local history librarian here at Westlake Porter Public Library in Westlake, Ohio, a western suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. Today is June 28th, 2018, and we are conducting this interview at the Westlake Porter Public Library. It is my pleasure to be interviewing today veteran Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Ely. Now, first we'll talk about some of the biographical details of your life. Where were your parents born?
My mom was born in a small town in Missouri called Sedalia, and my dad was born in Neola, Kansas.
Okay. And what were your parents' names and what were their occupations?
My dad's name was Gerald Franklin Ely, known as Jerry. My mom was Frances Elizabeth Ely, usually known as Fran.
And their occupations?
My dad basically was a career Army officer, and then he worked for the University of Missouri after his retirement. My mom was a homemaker and kind of later in life worked as a salesperson in a jewelry store.
Mm-hmm. Was your father an officer also?
Yep, father was an officer.
Okay. And did you have any brothers or sisters?
Nope, I'm an only child.
Okay. So now we'll talk about some of your early days in the service. What were you doing prior to entering the service?
I was a student at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, majoring in history and also enrolled in the Army ROTC program.
To enter the ROTC, was it a selective group, or did they take anybody who wanted to be in it?
At that time, which was 1960 to 1964, the first 2 years was mandatory for all male students, and then if you went into what was called the advanced course, you were accepted, assuming you had the grade point average and that kind of thing.
Okay, and were there extra classes that you took as part of the ROTC, or was it all sort of outside of the classroom?
No, you took, it was called MS3, MS4, which was the advanced course, and it was part of the curriculum of the university.
Okay. And in what branch of the military did you serve?
I was Army Field Artillery.
Okay. And I know we talked about this earlier, so the next question is, did you enlist where you were drafted, but you went into the Army?
Guess I volunteered.
You volunteered.
Because once you fulfilled the 2-year requirement, you didn't have to go into the advanced course. And in 1964, there was what, us old people called the draft. So if you graduated from college and you were liable for the draft, the fact that you took 2 years of ROTC was not an obligation. So I suppose I volunteered.
And you went, let's see. I guess the question I had then is, I lost my train of thought, but I was going to ask if you went straight from, I guess ROTC didn't guarantee a commission then in the Army, or you just entered?
Yeah, if you go through the ROTC program or one of the service academies and fulfill all of the requirements, you raise your right hand and you are commissioned an officer in the Navy, Army, or whatever.
And that was as a second lieutenant?
As a second lieutenant, okay. Or as an ensign in the Coast Guard and Navy.
Okay. Why did you choose the Army?
I suppose because my dad was in the Army.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
family tradition and history.
Yeah.
So once you completed college, what happened when you departed for training camp, and what was the early days of training like after once you got into the Army itself?
I graduated and got commissioned on I got commissioned on the 18th of June, 1964, and almost immediately left for the first training as an officer, which happened to be at the Air Defense School at Fort Bliss, Texas. To get a little technical, that was called the basic course. When you got commissioned in the Army, you then went to your initial schooling, which is called the basic course.
Okay.
So if you were commissioned in the armor, you went and learned how to drive tanks. If you were commissioned in the finance corps, you went to that basic course. So you went to a basic schooling of whatever branch of the Army you got commissioned in.
So you didn't go through the regular boot camp like the enlisted soldiers did, or
That part for ROTC students is done between your junior and senior year at what was called back then summer camp, which was 6 weeks of basic training. You had a drill sergeant, but the basic training part was for ROTC students was 6 weeks of what was then called summer camp.
okay.
In my case, at Fort Riley, Kansas.
So that's where you learned the stuff that you couldn't do during your ROTC
Right.
time, like shooting.
Actually, what it was is you put into practice what you learned in ROTC. It was an evaluation process, both for military skills such as map reading and that kind of thing, but also you held leadership positions, and there was an officer and a sergeant who evaluated you in addition to refining military skills such as map reading, rappelling, and all sorts of other, military skills.
Okay. Well, in your time, both with ROTC and then in your initial officer training after college, do you recall any of your instructors? If so, what were they like? Normally, this is asking about the drill sergeants, but for you, your case is a little different.
I'm sure that I don't remember his name. In ROTC summer camp, we had a sergeant who was essentially a drill sergeant, but I really don't remember him. I'm sure he made us do push-ups and acted like a drill sergeant, but I don't remember in the same way an enlisted man probably remembers his drill sergeant.
Mm-hmm. So yours is really a special case for you and the cohort that came from ROTC.
After this initial officer training, I then went to Fort Benning, Georgia, to learn how to jump out of airplanes. The drill sergeants there are called black hats because they wear a black Smokey the Bear hat.
Okay.
It was the best pure training that I had during the 23 years. They had one purpose and one purpose only: to teach you to come out of the airplane correctly, to check your chute correctly, and to hit the ground correctly so you wouldn't break your head. This was not an intellectual exercise. And so for the first 2 weeks, you simply repeatedly trained to come out of the airplane correctly, to check your chute correctly, and hit the ground correctly. And it was simply repetition. And so at the end of 2 weeks, you obviously were evaluated. You were confident in yourself, sort of, that you could do those 3 things. So it was the best pure training that I ever had.
And when you were done with the training, did that make you part of the airborne then, or was this just like a supplemental training to the rest of your other training?
In my case, well, it was because this gets a little technical. This was additional training that I was required to take because of the way I was commissioned.
Okay.
Now, I never served in the airborne. I did some additional jumps to qualify to wear the airborne wings.
Okay.
These, you have to make 5 jumps.
Okay.
I made an additional 10, but I never was in the 82nd Airborne or the 101st.
Okay.
Or Special Forces or any of the...
And was this prior to deployment to Vietnam?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know we've gotten into some of this already, but did you receive any specialized training? So in addition to what you described with the airborne training and then your initial officer training, was there any other specialized training you'd like to talk about?
Not prior to going to Vietnam.
What about you mentioned you were an artillery officer, so...
Well, now that you mention it, I had training in air defense artillery, and I also had training in field artillery. When in my initial assignment after learning how to jump out of airplanes was a field artillery unit in Germany, and I had additional training in chemical, biological, and radiological warfare, and also in how to prepare the guns to shoot a tactical nuclear weapon.
Now, for the training in the aircraft artillery, is that more like the anti-aircraft guns?
Right.
Okay. And then field artillery would be what, in support of ground troops?
Right, correct.
And other movements.
Correct.
Okay. So how did you adapt to military life, including both the physical regimen, barracks life, and food and social life?
I was an Army brat. So, you know, going into the military was not a change. There was a 6-year gap between the time my dad retired and the time I went in. But, you know, this was not some big shock that I went into. Even, you know, I mean, when I knew how to salute, so there was no, the transition was simple. I mean, I just wore different color clothes, that's all. I mean, there was no. I was an officer. I didn't spend a lot of time in the barracks. We got married just before I went into the Army, so Judy was always with me. So, the transition was easy. I knew the language, I knew the ranks, so there was this was not a change in lifestyle for me.
And that's a lot different than some of the other men I've interviewed. They came straight from civilian life with minimal sort of exposure to military life, and you were pretty well steeped in it your entire life. So, and then I guess once you're married, you get to live off base or have separate housing. So you're sort of spared the other sort of the communal life that the average infantryman or enlisted soldier is going to experience. Now, in the social life, were most of your friends and acquaintances other officers, or were they people outside of the base?
I mean, obviously, when you're stationed overseas, like my first real duty assignment in Germany, all of our friends were fellow lieutenants, captains, the people in the artillery unit. Throughout our military career, we usually, not always, but we usually lived off base, except when we were stationed in Germany. And the year that I spent at Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So most of the time we lived, quote, in the civilian community. Again, now, obviously, whatever I was doing, we had military friends, but we also had civilian friends. I'm not from here. I spent 5.5 years stationed in the greater Cleveland area, so all 90% of our friends now are civilians. There's a smattering of, former military, but most of them are civilians. So we had a good mix of both civilian and military.
Okay. Now this next section, we're going to talk a little bit more about your wartime service. So, where was your initial? I guess you are a Vietnam vet. You served in Vietnam. So, where in Vietnam were you stationed?
I served my first tour in Vietnam from September 1967 to September 1968. And that was located in, to be a little technical, Vietnam was divided into 4 corps. I Corps was up along the North Vietnamese border, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, which was sort of around Saigon, and then 4th Corps was the Mekong Delta. My first tour was in 3 Corps, basically around Saigon and about 50 miles east of Saigon. I had a second tour of Vietnam, which was basically all of 1971, and I was stationed in the Mekong Delta.
So further south than your original posting.
My first tour was with American units only. My second tour, theoretically, I was an advisor to Vietnamese. I was in Vietnam at 2 very interesting times. And it is now 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, as one of the things I gave you, 50 years since 1968, which was a watershed with regard to Vietnam in a lot of ways. And big build-up, Tet of 1968, etc. And then stationed in 1971, when it was obvious that we were leaving. And so very different times with regard to the number of American forces and and at least in my case, two totally different assignments and two totally different levels of activity, as I sometimes describe my second tour of Vietnam. I lived in an old French hotel.
Now, in the first tour, what were some of the main experiences that you had, or some of the main memories that you have from that first tour with the American groups and units?
Well, my first the first 4.5 months were relatively quiet from mid-September of 1967 until the end of January 1968, when at the end of January 1968, what has become known as just simply Tet occurred. And so from, basically the 1st of February of 1968 through mid-September of 1968, I had a very active, I suppose, wartime experience. I don't want to suggest that it was anything like Hamburger Hill or pitched battles or anything, but the danger level and the activity that I personally experienced between the first 4.5 months and the 7.5 months was certainly, the tempo was much different in my case. That second 7.5 months, simply because I was in command of a unit. Again, I don't want to suggest that we were. None of my soldiers were killed. Some wounded. I don't want to suggest that we were in constant battle or anything like that, but it was, active. And the probably, we got hit with mortar fire, we got hit in ambushes here and there. Again, I don't want to suggest that this was any kind of 16-day battle. No books are going to be written like the recent book on Way during Tet, but it was certainly much more active the second 7.5 months as opposed to the first 4.5. And certainly my second tour, as I said, I describe it as I lived in an old French hotel.
No, prior to the Tet offensive, did you have any sense that there was something building up, or that something was about to go off?
No. Where I was, it came as a complete surprise, as it did pretty much countrywide.
And at this time your unit was in Saigon or just outside of Saigon?
I'm sorry?
At this time your unit was stationed in Saigon or just outside of Saigon?
No, we were, at that time, I was stationed with what I call a mid-level artillery headquarters about 35 miles east of Saigon.
And what were your daily sort of duties with this group?
The first 4.5 months, I was an assistant operations officer at a mid-level field artillery headquarters. Basically, I was a tactical operations center duty officer. Every now and then I went out on an operation, but not anything serious. I mean, I spent a lot of time in a bunker monitoring radios and that kind of thing. And I did that for 5.5 months, and then commanded my unit for 6.5 months.
And you'd provide support whenever it was called in for by infantry units?
I commanded B Battery, 7th Battalion, 8th Artillery. We were a heavy artillery unit. Probably the first couple of months of my command, we were basically an on-call unit supporting other artillery units. My last, 3.5, 4 months, I had the pleasure of providing additional artillery support to the 11th Armored Cav Regiment's artillery, and at that time the 11th Armored Cav Regiment was commanded by one Colonel George Patton Jr., the son of General Patton. So, to be a little technical, I was a general support artillery unit, long-range artillery, as opposed to close-in artillery.
Now, when you say long range, how far of a distance are we talking?
I had 4 guns, 2 8-inch howitzers, and 2 175 guns. The 8-inch howitzers, about 20,000 meters. So what's that, 10 miles?
Mm-hmm. Yes, roughly. Yeah.
Very accurate. The maximum range of the 175 millimeter gun was 32,000 meters, which is 20 miles. It is very inaccurate at 20 miles. It's pretty inaccurate at about 18, or at about 22,000 meters. It's more of what's, again, this is a little technical. It's more of an area weapon than a point-to-point weapon.
I get in the aftermath of once the Tet offensive was sort of wrapped up, what you mentioned that the remainder of that first tour is pretty active. If you could elaborate on that a little bit more, I'd appreciate it.
Throughout 1968, beginning with Tet, it was very active, meaning both in the sense of getting out and, the infantry and the cav were out going after, quote, the bad guys. So probably, 75, 80% of the time, two of my guns were away from base camp. We shot lots and lots of rounds in support of other artillery units and sometimes in support of ground units. We certainly had a heightened sense of danger whenever we were on the road moving from point A to point B. You made sure that you were just busier and stuff. The tempo was higher. You were just busier, more alert. And you had stuff going on because, in Martin Luther King was killed while we were there, while I was in command. Bobby Kennedy was killed in June when I was in command. You had the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August of 1968 that was, quote, lots of riots and horses and stuff. You had racial tensions in the states. Unless I was deaf, dumb, and blind, I didn't have any racial problems in my unit. I didn't have any drug problems in my unit. It was just, I have often said that you had from the beginning of 1968 until really at the middle of August, the beginning of September, it's one of those periods in American history that you have to have been there to experience. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can read about it, and there's been a lot of it this year and stuff like that, but it was just a very hectic, dangerous, mind-boggling time.
Now, between your two tours, what did you come back to the States between your first and second tour?
I came back in mid-September of 1968, went to a field artillery, what's called the advanced course, 9 months of advanced training, had an administrative assignment, and then was basically in the fall of 1970 was basically given a choice of going either back to Vietnam or to Korea, and picked Vietnam.
Why would you choose Vietnam over Korea?
Korea's cold a lot of time. And I think, I had experience in Vietnam. So somebody, and I don't want to make this sound like I'm some big hero or this or something. I just thought if send a captain that's got that has experience versus a captain that doesn't have experience. Again, I don't have any medals that have a V, which is for valor. I I don't want to make my second tour sound that I was, some gun-ho. It's just, I had the experience and I thought it would better be utilized rather than somebody that didn't have the experience, but also the fact that I knew that it was cold in Korea a lot of the time.
Now, for the second tour, did you know that you would have more of an advisory role than active combat? So what was that like, commanding a South Vietnamese unit rather than an American, or advising a South Vietnamese unit?
Now, this gets technical. There were two types of advisors to the Vietnamese. The one type was advising, quote, regular military Vietnamese units, an infantry unit, an armor unit, an engineer unit, a field artillery unit. So a Vietnamese infantry division probably had a colonel as a senior division advisor and then other officers down the line. The second group of advisors advised the government infrastructure of the South Vietnamese government, which in a lot of cases, most cases, were also military. So I got assigned to MACV Advisory Team 65, whose job it was to advise the province chief, a Vietnamese colonel of Vinh Long province. A province in Vietnam was essentially a state. So Colonel Nia was the governor, if you will, of Vinh Long province. Vinh Long province was made up of 6 districts, basically counties. And so Colonel Nia and his staff, although military, were concerned, yes, with security, but they were also concerned with the economy. They were concerned with building roads. They were concerned with building schools. They were concerned with moving agricultural goods for rice from point A to the markets. So they were a government structure as opposed to fighting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. So they were like although they were military, they were stuff. So we theoretically were helping them do that.
So it's more of almost like a bureaucratic role than necessarily a purely military.
In essence, there was, in addition to the regular Vietnamese military, there were 2 other military parts to the Vietnamese military. One was called Regional Forces, and the second one was called Popular Forces. Regional forces could be compared to the Ohio National Guard. They could go anywhere in the province. Popular forces were village town oriented.
Okay.
So you had sort of a National Guard kind of thing called regional forces, and then you had popular forces. Probably you could call it a local militia more than, I mean, if you try it. But then Long Province, the province chief, they were very build roads, secure roads, build schools, build medical clinics, build marketplaces, and that kind of thing. They were very civilian or, the stuff.
So after your second tour in Vietnam was concluded, where did you go after that?
I went to graduate school at at Xavier University in Cincinnati, and following that, I went to teach Army ROTC at the University of Arizona.
Okay. I guess another question about your time in Vietnam. Sorry to be skipping around, but how did you feel whenever you saw any casualties or the destruction that entails war? What did that? How did that make you feel?
Excuse me.
Bless you.
As I said earlier, although I had when I was in command, none of my soldiers were killed. Maybe 15 suffered some level of being wounded. None, some serious, but none, quote, life-threatening. I can the randomness of it, you and I could be standing next to each other and, you get one through the head and I don't. I think you wonder how you're going to react the first time that, quote, the bullets start flying. How are you going to react? All the training in the world, all the preparation in the world, it does not prepare you for the first time you get mortared, for the first time an RPG or, bullets start flying. It isn't it. on one occasion, actually after I, oh no, actually as I was waiting to go home the first time, I ended up at an evacuation hospital and helped for probably 45 minutes unload seriously wounded soldiers off of helicopters who were being brought in. And I have no idea how many, but it seemed like there was 50 helicopters with 4 or 5 bodies, just, one right after another landing at this. And, you wonder stuff. I mean, I never really had that kind of experience. My wounded were onesies and twosies. They were not, we were never attacked like the Alamo. Mm-hmm. There's in the little book that I gave you, there's a couple of stories in there about nurses and stuff, who just day after day after day after day after day, see, people coming in and with, arms blown off and that kind of thing.
Now, during your time in the service, what sort of friendships and camaraderie did you form while serving, and with whom did you typically form those bonds?
The military is a unique institution. It is by no means perfect. It is the most democratic institution in the sense that it throws together people from diversity, the popular thing, diversity. It throws people from different backgrounds, and it turns them into and sends them off to units which are diverse. And I laugh when politicians and people say, well, the military is not a social integration. That's not the job of the military. Well, guess what? From time immemorial, the military has stuff. Now, William Tecumseh Sherman did not believe that blacks could be good soldiers. It took to 1948 and even into my time in the 1960s for the military to be integrated. Well, if that wasn't a social experiment, I don't know what is. So the Civil War, people from Wisconsin went to Alabama when they hadn't been 15 miles from where they were born. And so the military is this hodgepodge of people from all parts of the country, from different colors, different educational backgrounds, and all of that. And yes, you have longtime friends, but in a lot of cases, and I think in mine, I certainly have friends and people we keep in contact with that we met in the military. I have a pretty good friend at church who's also a Vietnam vet. And he goes to about 3 or 4 reunions a year. He's close to the people that he knew in his platoon, in his company, and his battalion. I don't have that kind of connection. I do have connection with some soldiers from my unit that I commanded. I do have connections with people I have served with. But I don't have the connection that my church friend has with former members of his unit, that in the sense his company commander recently died and is going to be buried at Arlington, and he's going to go to the funeral. He and a bunch of the men are going to go to the funeral. I don't have that kind of connection. 15, when did Phil die? Last January. My driver, Phil Driscoll, good old boy from Anadarko, Oklahoma, who was my driver in Vietnam for 6.5 months. We reconnected about 10 years ago. And sadly, January of 2017, Phil died, is buried out in Oklahoma. His wife sent me cartridge from the salute that they did at his funeral, and wrote a very touching letter about how much he thought of me and all that kind of stuff. I got an email over the weekend. I got an email earlier this week that the captain that I took over from died. I didn't know him well. I'm in close contact with my executive officer, Lee Cornelison, who lives down in a retirement community in the Tucson area. So I have friends around, but not as close as my church friend, who is really deep into maintaining contact with fellow people from his unit.
Now, while you were serving overseas, how did you manage to keep in touch with your family and friends from back home in the United States?
It's called snail mail. I retired in 1987. There was no internet. It was very expensive to call from Germany. When I was in Vietnam, it's snail mail, 5 to 7 days.
So lots of letters.
Lots of letters. And probably, as I've said a number of times, and I had an opportunity to write a lot. And sadly, all of the letters that I got and all of the letters that I wrote are in some landfill somewhere. And I wish I would have had the forethought to save them.
Mm-hmm. Now, how often would you write to your wife?
Oh, probably 4 times a week.
And just basically say this,
as I said, I'm an only child, so I got letters from my wife, I got letters from my mother, and I got letters from my father. So I got lots and lots of mail. And I wrote, and again, and especially the second tour, I mean, I had a very routine, non-dangerous job to where I'm sure that I probably wrote a letter 5 or 6 times. 5 or 6 times a week. I mean, my second tour was very routine. First tour, and stuff. And mail, very important. Very important. I have often said that I am glad, in a way, that it was snail mail. If you were one of my soldiers, well, in my own personal case, let's assume that let's assume that the dishwasher went out when I was in Vietnam the first time. I learned about that 5 to 7 days after the dishwasher went out. Today, I would learn about it 10 minutes after the dishwasher went out. Or if the kid fell off the swing and broke its arm. Mm-hmm. I would learn about that 5 to 7 days after. Today, with all of the technology, what impact happens in Westlake, Ohio, affects somebody in Korea or on a ship at sea or at Yokohama Naval Air Station. Gee, I'm sorry, dear, that the car broke down on Tuesday. It's now next Tuesday. I assume that you got it fixed. So I think a commander's job is more difficult because all of a sudden PFC Statler learns that his 6-year-old son fell off the swing set and broke his arm. Mm-hmm. And you learned that within
minutes or hours.
Minutes. And so It was, you know, and one of my cute stories is one of my soldiers asked to see me. I said, "Can I have the first sergeant here?" And he said, "No, sir, I'd like just to talk to you." And I said, "Okay." So I said, "What can I do for you?" He said, "Sir, my wife is 7 months pregnant." "Congratulations." "Sir, I haven't seen her in 7 months." "First sergeant, get in here." So what happened? He got a letter.
A Dear John letter?
Huh?
A Dear John letter?
It wasn't a Dear John letter. It was a letter, her apologizing, and I got lonely, and it, da 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 da. And commanders and first sergeants are supposed to solve stuff like that. So the point is, in today's age, he would have learned that the instant she found out she was pregnant, probably. Whereas, and the soldier expects the system to do something. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, everything was done by snail mail. Although people did tape recordings, people did, you know, home movie kinds of things and stuff like that, you know. But it was, you know, snail mail.
But it still sounds like the mail arrived fairly regularly and pretty quickly. I mean, 5 to 7 days is
right.
That's
right.
You can't get that service nowadays. Okay. When you were off duty, what sort of things did you do for recreation or to keep yourself busy?
Well, you know, if you're talking about I mean, if you're, you know, I spent my last 3 years in Germany. So we went to a lot of different places. You know, you know, when you, as I fondly say, there is no bad beer and there's no bad schnitzel in Germany. You know, if you're stationed somewhere that you know, we were stationed in Tucson, Arizona for 2.5 years. Did a lot of sightseeing. You know, went to the Grand Canyon. Went to a lot of different stuff. I mean, you do stuff that civilians do now. You know, my 2 tours of Vietnam. You're staying pretty busy doing stuff, so you're not. I'm trying to think. Oh, I know two things that I did that is kind of interesting. During my second tour, for a week, I was an escort officer for a USO show. A small not Bob Hope, but a small USO show. uh, a magician, and I think there were 3 or 4 young lady singers, nobody famous, who were touring small units, not, they weren't performing before 5,000 soldiers. They were performing in a club or
Okay.
at a fire base, singing. And the magician could do big things, but he could also sit around a table with 8 people and do card tricks and, pull stuff out of your ear and stuff. But, in Vietnam, I think we played some volleyball. There was, that kind of thing. Volleyball. I'm sure we played some poker.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, other places we did what civilians did. We sightseed and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Now we're going to switch our focus now to, I guess, the end of your time in Vietnam, and then you're coming home. So the war ended in '74. What were you doing at that point in your career?
As I've often said, I stayed in the family. I am the son, of an Army officer. So when I came home both times, I stayed in the Army. Now the second time, I got home in mid-December of 1971, and immediately a month later started graduate school in Cincinnati, Ohio. Hardly the hotbed of post-protest movements. I never was faced with the kind of for lack of a better term, hate and discontent that a lot of people face. I came home. Now, that doesn't mean that I thought that the way things were going we were a pretty cynical bunch. But I never was faced with, quote, rejection. When I got home the first time, I picked Judy up and we went almost immediately to Fort Sill, to Lawton, Oklahoma. Lawton, Oklahoma is a military town. Nobody was protesting, calling us baby. I was never called a baby killer. I was, that kind of thing. I stayed in the family.
Mm-hmm.
For a year, I was a civilian going to grad school. People didn't understand that I was in the Army going to grad school because they thought we were all at Vietnam. What was I doing going to grad school? And then after a year, I went to Tucson, Arizona to teach ROTC. Hardly the hotbed of protest movements. the University of Arizona wore the uniform on campus, never faced any kind of yelling and screaming or anything like that. It stuff. Not surprised at the second tour. Our job when I was, quote, an advisor, our job was to provide stuff to the Vietnamese. And in our case, the stuff was so that the Vietnamese could build bridges, could maintain the roads, could build marketplaces, and so we became a supplier as opposed to advising them on military tactics. Now, 1968 was the buildup. Mm-hmm. By 1971, unless you were deaf, dumb, and blind, we were leaving. I think when I got to my assignment in the second tour, I think there were 135 Americans on this advisory team. When I walked out the door, as I remember, there were like 30. So somebody was going to turn out the light.
Mm-hmm. And they weren't replacing the ones who went home.
And we were all going home. So it was obvious that, and by 1971, quote, American ground forces were being withdrawn also. So it was obvious that eventually we were going to go home. Mm-hmm. And we were the suppliers to the Vietnamese. And so when, after, as we entered 1973, 74, and 75, and Congress cut off funding and wouldn't allow Ford to supply the Vietnamese, what occurred in April of 1975 was not a surprise.
And that's when the North Vietnamese overran the rest of the South.
That's, I'm sitting in Tucson, Arizona, watching the helicopters off of the, American embassy and stuff. Not a surprise. Mm-hmm. I mean, not a surprise.
You definitely saw that coming.
Because when you go from 1968, when there were 500,000 down to, not a surprise.
No. Now let's go to after the war and after your service. Do you belong to any veterans organizations, or do you?
The only sort of veterans organization that I belong to is one called the Military Officers Association of America, which is basically made up of retired officers. For a time, So that's the only one I currently belong to. Depending, especially the enlisted soldiers who tried to join, or who joined or tried to join the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, were met with a certain amount of hostility by the World War II Korean era veterans. And as a result, they formed the Vietnam Veterans of America. We were losers. Now, but even within, not so much, I don't think it's not present now, but back in its formative years, there was a certain amount of tension between enlisted and officers and what was referred to back then as lifers, which are career guys, versus the 2 and 3 year people. And so when I retired, which was 1987, I joined a local chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America. But once it was found out that I was an officer and had served 23 years, I'm not saying there was hostility, but I never felt that welcome. That's dissipated now. That's not the case anymore. But, for 10 years or so, after, the mid 70s to the mid 80s, there was, so the direct answer to your question is, I'm not a member of American Legion. I'm not a member of the VFW. I'm not a member of the Vietnam Veterans of America. I was never wounded. So the only, now I wear this all the time. But I'm not active in veterans organizations.
Okay. And then once you retired from the military, you said 1987. What did you do after, and as a civilian then?
I putzed around for about 5 years. Worked for J.C. Penney. Taught history and political science for what was then Dyke College, which was an inner city college downtown in downtown Cleveland. And then I became the purest of the pure political appointees. I became a bailiff for a county judge here in Cuyahoga County which I did for 11 and a half years, and then I retired.
So now your time. Now this time is your time to.
Um,
This time now is your time to do what you want, and
I'm sorry?
I said this time now is for you to do what you want. You've had
Yeah.
enough work.
And I do a lot of volunteer work. I've done a fair amount of this in schools. Haven't done it lately. I'm active in my church. I have what I call a active social life, in the sense that, yesterday I went to lunch with a friend. Tomorrow I'm going to go lunch with a friend. Today I'm doing this with you. I have my paper BlackBerry filled with, I have a baseball buddy. We go to see the Indians play. I have a little part-time job that I actually don't call work, because I go in when I want to, I leave when I want to. They pay for parking and they pay for coffee. And when I want to take a week off, I don't ask permission. I just tell them I'm taking a week off. I don't have to, and it's about a 2 hour a day job. It's not, So I have, I tend not. The things that I've done in schools have been more of stuff like this, to where I'm making a presentation to a class or answering questions like I'm doing for you. I don't do parades. I'm very proud of my military service. I got stickers on my cars. I wear my hat. But I'm not involved in a lot of the veterans stuff. Like with the VFW or the American Legion or stuff like that.
Okay, so the last section here, we're talking about some. I guess what were some of your, or let's see, how did your wartime experiences affect your life? Once, even as in the military or later career, does it? How did that, I guess, affect your later career or the rest of your career in the military?
The last time I knew, when you went to basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, there was a sign, and it said, "Mission first, people always." The military is made up of people. And an officer, whether it's a combat arms officer in the infantry or the field artillery or something, or the finance corps or cybersecurity or whatever, there's no greater honor and there's no greater responsibility than being entrusted with, quote, the health and welfare of somebody's son or daughter or sister or brother or aunt or uncle. In spite, I am not a technical guy. I suspect if there are 100 people in this library, there is only one that doesn't have a cell phone, and that's me. We have one. I don't know where it is. Okay? So when I'm talking to you on the phone, I'm talking to you on a landline, not on a cell phone. The military is made up of people. And there is a difference, one of the things that the military taught me, there is a difference between leadership and management. The director of this library hopefully is both a manager and a leader. You know, he's a manager, he's got to do budgets, he's got to make sure the bills get paid, maybe. He's got to make sure that the building is open and stuff. But hopefully he or she is also a leader. And management and leadership are two different things. Mm-hmm. Now, civilians, you know, if you're the commander, you know, the phrase is, you get credit for what goes right and you get bang for what goes wrong. And so the military taught me leadership. And it also taught me some management skills, but it also taught me leadership. And they're two different things. Mm-hmm. And people are the most important facet, in spite of all the technology and all of the bells and whistles that we now have, that it still comes down to, quote, taking care of the troops. Because if you take care of the troops will take care of you. And it's a different relation to the officer enlisted relationship is different from your library director and you. I would assume that you call your library director by his first name. Mm-hmm. Nobody called me when I was in command of B Battery, 7th Battalion, 8th Artillery, Doug. They might have behind my back, but they didn't to my face. So the relationship is much different. There is a line. But if you're good at what you do, everybody understands the line. When I reconnected with my driver, I found out and Phil was 4 years younger than I was. And a driver to a commander is like your valet, if you will. And Phil Driscoll was this good old boy from Anadarko, Oklahoma. Spent 3 years, got out, got his degree, and eventually became the director of Veterans Affairs for the state of Oklahoma. Is in his university's Hall of Fame. And I said to him one time, yeah, I just retired as a lieutenant colonel. I never became the director of Veterans Affairs for the state of Missouri. And I certainly am not in the University of Missouri's Hall of Fame. So, here is somebody who was my driver, who got out and became, quote, more successful, if you will, than I did. And I think besides the fact that you are involved with something greater than yourself, and whether it was in Vietnam or whether it was not in Vietnam, and I don't want to overplay this, but in fact, you're an officer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And, it depends on what kind of job you have, where you're stationed, and all of that kind of stuff. I don't want to make this a political discussion. But when President Trump just sort of decided that he wanted to have a parade, on Veterans Day,
yes,
I suspect that there wasn't a soldier, sailor, airman, or anybody else, much less the people that had to plan it, that thought that that was a good idea. Now, if they do it, they'll do it. But a parade, give me and stuff. And I think that finally, when you enlist or when you are commissioned, you take an oath not to an individual, like occurred with the German army with Adolf Hitler. You take it to this concept called the Constitution of the United States. And the vast majority of people take that totally seriously. Now, as I said at the beginning, the military is not a perfect institution. It's made up of people. People do stupid things, but it's it's kind of like, in order to form a more perfect union, it's a work in progress. Like I said earlier, there's no greater honor than commanding American soldiers, whether it's in commanding or supervising. And I mean, because in a lot of cases, you're supervising, not commanding.
Mm-hmm. Now, one final question. What message, if any, would you like to leave for future generations who may see or hear this interview? And it's kind of a deep question, but...
That people I happen to be one who believes that people who say to me every now and then or to somebody else, thank you for your service, are being genuine. And if you see, especially, in an airport or someplace, especially a youngster, is to say, I don't think. I mean, I don't have to have people thank me for my service, but I think that if you see somebody in an airport, or if you see somebody in a restaurant, if you see somebody, wherever, and they've got the uniform, and I'm talking about young people, I'm not talking about, if you see some sergeant with all sorts of bangles and stuff, yeah, okay, but, somebody, if your nephew or your sister-in-law's second cousin, is, thank that person, or go to the swearing-in ceremony when they go in the military or something like that. Because they need that kind of encouragement.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time. And once again, this is Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Eli, and I'm Chad Stotler for the Westlake Porter Public Library. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.